On May 4, 1945, the Tangamundabridge spanning the Elbe River had become a gateway between life and death. What remained of this structure was barely recognizable as a bridge at all. German forces had demolished it deliberately on April 12th, hoping to slow the American advance, but now its twisted steel beams and shattered concrete formed the only crossing point for hundreds of kilometers in either direction. Thousands upon thousands were about to depend on those broken remains. The weight was almost unbearable. Damaged metal groaned and shifted beneath the endless procession of bodies streaming across it. German soldiers moved single file through the wreckage, navigating carefully around jagged edges and unstable sections. What had once been a modern marvel of engineering now looked like the skeleton of something that had died violently. Yet it held. Somehow it held. 2 weeks earlier, American forces had reached the Elbe, establishing their positions according to arrangements made far away at Yalta. But nobody in the planning rooms back then had foreseen this. Intelligence officers in the 102nd Infantry Division sector had intercepted signals revealing the scope of what was coming. Wehrmacht units were abandoning their positions, not retreating in disorder, but systematically pulling back. Mass movement was being detected, heading toward American lines. The estimates were staggering. Somewhere between 100,000 soldiers and civilians were trying to escape westward, funneling through whatever destroyed infrastructure remained. Captain William Patterson of the 400 Tug 5 Infantry Regiment lowered his field glasses and let them rest around his neck. Before him stretched an endless human column, an almost biblical procession moving toward the river crossing. He watched the faces as they passed. Some looked desperate, others seemed almost relieved, as if they'd made a choice and could finally breathe. What was about to unfold at this location would become the largest voluntary military surrender in Western history. But it wasn't surrender in the traditional sense. It was survival. That fundamental calculation had become starkly clear to German commanders by late April. Soviet captivity meant probable death. American captivity meant probable survival. Intelligence reports reaching headquarters painted an extraordinary picture of what was happening across German lines. These weren't disorganized soldiers running in panic. Wehrmacht forces were executing a coordinated retreat. They were methodically destroying their own equipment when it slowed them down. They were fighting through SS blocking detachments that tried to prevent them from leaving, units that remained fanatically loyal to an ideology that was collapsing around them. Some officers were executing their own men rather than let them surrender to the wrong side. The machine that had once been Europe's most formidable military was dissolving into a human river, all of it flowing in one direction. Every unit, every scattered group, every soldier who could move was being drawn toward a single objective: the western bank of the Elbe River. That's where the Americans were. That's where survival lay. German military intelligence had intercepted Soviet radio communications months earlier. What they learned was terrifying. Casualty projections for Wehrmacht prisoners taken by the Red Army were catastrophic. Out of every 100 German soldiers captured, the statistics suggested fewer than 40 would survive to ever see home again. When the actual numbers came in after the war, they proved even worse. The strategic situation was beyond redemption. The Soviets had overwhelming numbers and momentum on their side. 8 million German civilians were fleeing westward from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, trying to outrun the advancing Russian armies. Behind those refugees came Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front, crushing the last organized German resistance with stupendous superiority in troops and equipment. The Soviets had 20 divisions for every German division still capable of fighting. Their mechanized spearheads were covering 30 kilometers daily. German refugee columns were managing perhaps 10 kilometers on their best days. The outcome was inevitable. Historians would later recover Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final strategic assessment, captured when Germany surrendered. It contained a single underlined directive: maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This wasn't pessimism or defeatism. It was a commander recognizing a fundamental reality about how the world had changed. Surrender to Americans meant probable survival. Capture by Soviets meant probable death. The Yalta Agreement had already decided who would occupy which zones, but German commanders were betting everything on one observation. American forces had halted at the Elbe as agreed with their Soviet allies. If German units could cross that river before Soviet forces arrived from the east, they would enter American custody. This wasn't about victory or negotiated peace anymore. It was about the basic human possibility of living through captivity. The American forces holding the Western Bank possessed logistical capabilities that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. Each infantry division had attached military police battalions, field kitchens capable of feeding 15,000 men daily, mobile medical units with surgical capabilities, and vast supply stockpiles that reflected the enormous productive capacity of American industry. Major James Morrison served as operations officer for the 102nd Infantry Division. He'd studied mass surrender logistics after the Ruhr Pocket operation in mid-April, where 325,000 Germans had surrendered at once. His calculations were sobering. Processing 1,000 prisoners required 3 tons of food daily, 5,000 gallons of water, medical screening for typhus and dysentery, delousing stations, and administrative documentation that generated 12 forms per individual. The Geneva Convention mandated specific caloric intakes for prisoners. Those who worked received 2,080 to 2,100 calories. Those who didn't work received 2,000. These weren't just numbers on a piece of paper. They represented the difference between order and chaos when dealing with desperate humanity on a massive scale. The German forces approaching the Elbe represented the full spectrum of Wehrmacht dissolution. Some Waffen-SS units still possessed operational Tiger tanks and sophisticated communications equipment. Regular army divisions had been reduced to battalion strength, many soldiers carrying only personal weapons. Volkssturm units brought children as young as 14 and elderly men over 60, many armed only with armbands and obsolete rifles from the First World War. Behind the combat troops came support personnel, construction battalions, Luftwaffe ground crews left without aircraft to fly, Kriegsmarine sailors from destroyed ports, and female auxiliary staff who faced particular horrors if captured by Soviet forces. Intelligence analysis calculated German forces east of the Elbe at approximately 1.2 million as of April 25, 1945. Of these, 300,000 were in organized combat units, 400,000 were support personnel, and 500,000 were scattered Wehrmacht and Volkssturm members already flowing westward. The critical factor was movement rate. Soviet mechanized spearheads could advance 50 kilometers daily. German units on foot managed 30 kilometers under the best conditions. The window for escape was measured in hours, not days. The first major turning point came on April 20, 1945, when General Walter Wenck received Hitler's order to attack toward Berlin with his 12th Army. Instead, Wenck made a fateful decision that would save hundreds of thousands of lives. Rather than waste his forces in a futile assault on the Soviet encirclement of Berlin, he decided to use his army to hold open an escape corridor to the American lines. His headquarters near Belzig became the center of this extraordinary decision. Wenck gathered his commanders and spoke with remarkable clarity about what needed to happen next. "Comrades," he told them, "the war is lost. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology, but to the living. Our soldiers and the civilians depending on us. We attack but westward to open a path to the Americans." This was calculated humanity, not cowardice. Wenck's intelligence officer, Colonel Gunther Reichelm, had compiled devastating statistics from Soviet-occupied territories. In East Prussia alone, an estimated 300,000 civilians had died during the Soviet advance, from combat, exposure, revenge killings, and mass rape. If those same ratios were applied to the populations now trapped between the Elbe and the advancing Soviet armies, the potential casualties were staggering. Millions could perish. By April 24th, forward American observation posts were reporting extraordinary scenes. German vehicles approached the Elbe without tactical spacing, headlights blazing in violation of basic combat security. Wehrmacht units arrived in organized formations, their officers maintaining military bearing even in the face of defeat. These were not beaten rabble. They were organized forces making a deliberate choice to surrender rather than continue resistance. Captain Robert Thornton commanded a reconnaissance company of the 2nd Armored Division. He radioed back to division headquarters with a report that seemed almost impossible. German forces approaching our positions are not attacking. They're displaying white flags and requesting terms. Within hours, the trickle became a flood. The U.S. Ninth Army processed 3,000 voluntary surrenders on April 24th. The number jumped to 7,025 on April 25th and 15,000 on April 26th. These weren't combat captures, but deliberate surrenders by units still possessing ammunition and fighting capability. The precedent had been set earlier in April at the Ruhr Pocket. When Field Marshal Walter Model dissolved Army Group B, rather than formally surrender, 325,000 German troops had given themselves up to American forces. The treatment they received made all the difference. Food, medical care, protection from revenge-seeking displaced persons. Word spread through Wehrmacht communication channels with remarkable speed. American signals intelligence intercepted radio conversations between German units that revealed the psychological shift occurring across the entire Wehrmacht. On April 27th, the commander of 3rd Panzer Corps transmitted a message that captured the moment. Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points, medical treatment provided, food distribution confirmed. That last point was crucial. German forces had been on starvation rations for weeks. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Units that had fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching American lines alive. Sergeant Wilhelm Becker of the 21st Panzer Division later testified about those final days. We had heard the Americans fed prisoners, provided medical care, didn't shoot the wounded. After years of total war, such humanity seemed impossible. Yet we raced toward it anyway. But reaching American lines required surviving a deadly gauntlet. SS blocking detachments had orders to execute any soldier retreating without authorization. Military police units established checkpoints on all western roads, turning back deserters or shooting them where they stood. The SS remained fanatically loyal even as the Reich collapsed, viewing surrender as betrayal rather than survival. The Battle of Halbe from April 24th to May 1st represented perhaps the bloodiest example of this human cost. General Theodor Busse commanded the Ninth Army, which found itself encircled southeast of Berlin. 200,000 soldiers and 40,000 civilians were trapped in that pocket. Hitler ordered them to fight toward Berlin and link up with the capital's defenders. Instead, Busse coordinated with Wenck to break out westward toward American lines. The breakout began at 2 a.m. on April 25th. Leading elements of the 11th SS Panzer Corps used their last fuel reserves to punch through Soviet lines near Halbe village. Behind them came an extraordinary procession. Combat troops, medical units, administrative personnel, civilian refugees, military dependents, even regimental bands carrying their instruments. The columns stretched 30 kilometers through the Spree forest, a serpentine mass of humanity stumbling through swamps and woods in gathering darkness. Soviet forces reacted with overwhelming firepower. Katyusha rocket batteries fired into packed columns. Sturmovik aircraft strafed anything that moved. T-34 tanks crushed defensive positions and the people manning them. The forest became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled up at stream crossings where Soviet machine gunners had perfect fields of fire. Wounded soldiers who couldn't keep up were abandoned where they fell. Officers made impossible choices. Colonel Hans von Luck commanded the remnants of a panzer regiment. He described what happened in those terrible hours. No longer war, but massacre. Soviet artillery turned forest paths into death zones. We kept moving because stopping meant certain death. I saw officers shoot their own wounded rather than leave them for Soviet capture. The statistics were catastrophic. Of 200,000 who began the breakout, approximately 40,000 reached Wenck's lines and eventual American captivity. 60,000 were captured by Soviet forces. Few of those would survive captivity. The remainder simply vanished, killed in unnamed skirmishes, drowned attempting river crossings, lost in the forest's depths. The Halbe Forest Cemetery today contains 24,000 graves, most marked unknown German soldier. General Wenck's 12th Army performed one of the war's most remarkable humanitarian operations. Defying Hitler's direct orders to attack toward Berlin, Wenck instead established a 40-kilometer corridor from the Elbe River to the scattered remnants of German forces trapped to the east. His 100,000 troops, including elite Panzergrenadier and SS divisions, held this passage against Soviet pressure while refugees streamed through like water finding its level. The general established his headquarters in a schoolhouse near Fürth, transforming it into a coordination center for the evacuation. His staff worked around the clock, organizing transportation for wounded, distributing the army's last food supplies to civilians, and maintaining radio contact with scattered German units still fighting their way west. Lieutenant Hans Mermann served in Wenck's operations section and recorded the magnitude of their task. "We estimate 500,000 civilians in our sector, plus remnants of 20 different military units. No food for civilians. Medical supplies exhausted. Ammunition sufficient for perhaps 48 hours of combat. Yet we must hold until all who can be saved reach American lines." Wenck personally visited forward positions, encouraging exhausted soldiers to hold just a few more days. To his men, many of them teenagers from training schools or elderly Volkssturm, he became a figure of almost mythical determination. One soldier later recalled the impact of his presence. He could have fled. Senior officers were disappearing daily, heading west in staff cars. Wenck stayed, and because he stayed, we stayed. The general's tactical brilliance showed in his defensive positioning. Rather than attempting to hold a continuous line, he established strong points at key road junctions and river crossings, forcing Soviet units to deploy for formal attacks rather than simply pursuing. This bought precious time for the refugee columns, though at terrible cost to the defending units. The damaged Tangamundabridge became the focal point of the evacuation. Wehrmacht engineers had blown the modern structure on April 12th to slow the American advance. Ironically, its twisted remains now served as the only crossing point for 50 kilometers in either direction. German military engineers and American combat engineers worked from opposite banks to shore up the wreckage, creating a precarious single-file pathway across the river. The scenes at the crossing defied military precedent. From May 4 to May 7th, an estimated 100,000 people crossed the broken structure. Wehrmacht colonels directed traffic alongside American sergeants. German military police maintained order on the eastern approach, while American MPs controlled the western bank. Both sides understood that chaos meant disaster. If the crossing became blocked, thousands would be trapped as Soviet forces approached. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis of the 102nd Infantry Division described the surreal cooperation that emerged between enemies. "German officers saluted us. We saluted back. Their engineers asked our engineers for equipment to strengthen the bridge. We gave it to them. Everyone understood lives depended on keeping that crossing open. The human stream was endless and heartbreaking. A Wehrmacht colonel arrived with a complete regimental staff and insisted on formally surrendering his unit's battle flag. An SS general appeared in full-dress uniform, requesting honorable captivity for his men. A naval captain led 200 Kriegsmarine sailors who hadn't seen the ocean in months, having been pressed into ground combat. Male auxiliary personnel, some as young as 17, begged American soldiers not to send them back east. Most poignant were the civilians. Families pushed belongings in baby carriages and wheelbarrows. Children separated from parents in the chaos were passed hand to hand across the broken bridge, a fragile human chain between two banks and two different futures. Frail elderly people found themselves being carried across by compassionate strangers. Hospital patients, many still confined to their beds, were transported carefully by medical personnel who'd made the choice to stay with them rather than abandon them. Master Sergeant James Patterson, who supervised operations from the western perimeter, later recorded his observations. "They arrived continuously," he noted. Dawn melted into dusk, and the flow continued through the night under moonlight. Soldiers still armed stacked their weapons into rough piles. Women carried babies in their arms. Children barely old enough for regular school wore Wehrmacht uniforms. Older men displayed Volkssturm armbands. They were utterly exhausted. Complete surrender was universal. Relief flooded their faces, knowing they'd reached safety. The sheer numbers created a crisis for American administration. The Geneva Convention was clear about requirements. Each prisoner needed proper documentation, medical evaluation, and sufficient food and shelter. Processing a single individual correctly took approximately 20 minutes. During peak arrival periods, 20,000 prisoners were coming across daily. The entire system buckled under such overwhelming numbers. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, serving as Chief of Staff for the 18th Airborne Corps, made a critical choice. Abandon the paperwork. Feed them first. Delousing comes second. Provide medical treatment to those who are injured. Documentation can be sorted out later. Life preservation takes priority. His pragmatic decision rescued countless people but created administrative complications that lasted for years. Families became separated in the overwhelming chaos. Many would never see one another again. Soldiers got split from their units, making it impossible to determine accurate casualty figures. Potentially dangerous war criminals disappeared into the massive crowd. Yet the only alternative, turning people away, was simply unthinkable. The medical emergency was genuinely severe. Army doctors estimated 30% of those surrendering required urgent treatment. Malnutrition was universal after months surviving on minimal food. Typhus transmitted through body lice threatened to become a widespread epidemic. Wounds sustained weeks earlier had rotted and become infected. Surgical teams designed to handle dozens were operating on hundreds each day. Captain David Miller, a medical officer with the 330 Medical Battalion, performed continuous surgery for 72 hours without stopping. These weren't fresh battle injuries. These were old wounds, gangrenous, neglected. Soldiers had been walking on fractures, fighting with metal fragments still lodged in their bodies. Women dealt with injuries from violent assault, left untreated. Children showed malnutrition so severe they couldn't even stand on their feet. The supply chain struggled despite American resources. One infantry division carried rations meant for 15,000 soldiers for a week. By May 5th, they were feeding 60,000 prisoners and countless civilians. Supply convoys ran night and day from rear supply points. C-47 transport planes dropped provisions by parachute. The Red Ball Express, which had kept supply lines flowing across France, returned to its vital role of feeding former enemies. At Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight Eisenhower confronted an impossible situation. Yalta agreements were unambiguous. German forces must surrender to all allies together. Separate surrenders to Western powers while continuing to fight the Soviets violated Allied agreements. Yet the human suffering was undeniable. On May 4th, Admiral Karl Dönitz, who'd inherited leadership after Hitler, sent Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg to speak with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Friedeberg's proposal was explicit. All German forces in northwestern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands would surrender to Western allies immediately, permitting maximum evacuation away from the east. Montgomery, bound by Allied commitments, could only accept complete surrender to all allies. But he grasped the profound human stakes. Years later, in his written recollections, he observed something crucial. These Germans weren't merely seeking military terms, they were searching for protection from what the Russians might do. We could offer them proper treatment. What awaited them under Soviet rule remained an appalling mystery. The practical solution was clear. German units reaching American lines before the formal May 8 surrender would be accepted as prisoners. Those arriving afterward would face compulsory return to Soviet control. This established a crucial deadline: cross the Elbe before midnight on May 8 or risk Soviet imprisonment. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, later acknowledged what was happening. We knew the reality of what we were doing. We were accepting surrender from enemies still technically fighting alongside our Soviet allies. Yet we also understood what Soviet captivity meant for those men. Sometimes doing right outweighs following the rulebook. From May 4th through May 8th, scenes of stunning intensity unfolded everywhere. Knowing formal surrender was hours away, German units threw off military discipline. Soldiers discarded equipment to move faster. Officers destroyed records rather than slow their movement westward. Entire divisions disintegrated as individual soldiers made personal decisions to flee toward the west. The damaged Torgau crossing operated around the clock. After Soviet guns came within range on May 6th, the human tide kept flowing. American artillery commanders ordered their guns to provide protective fire against Soviet positions, effectively defending Germans as they surrendered. It was perhaps the war's most extraordinary moment. Americans and Germans working together while technically still fighting. At 02:41 hours on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Rans. The ceasefire would begin at 2301 hours on May 8th. German forces therefore had exactly 45 hours to reach American positions. The most desperate race against time in modern warfare commenced. What followed defied conventional military description. This wasn't conventional retreat or typical surrender, but rather human movement under arms. Approximately 250,000 German soldiers remained east of the Elbe on May 7th. Within those 45 hours, roughly 180,000 would successfully cross to American lines. The remainder would fall into Soviet hands with catastrophic results. General Wenck's concluding efforts embodied military honor even in defeat. His 12th Army maintained its corridor as long as possible, enabling survivors from the 9th Army and hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens to escape. Wenck positioned his remaining tanks and gun batteries to hold back Soviet forces while the exodus proceeded. At 1800 hours on May 7th, Wenck issued his last command. The 12th Army has completed its final duty. We have rescued those we could save. Every officer is now at liberty to ensure his soldiers' safety. This wasn't technically a surrender, but rather a release of duty, permitting his men to decide their own fates. Wenck crossed himself at 0200 hours on May 8th, walking over a broken railroad bridge near Torgau, departing less than 21 hours before the ceasefire took effect. Behind him, Soviet armored vehicles were already moving into positions his forces had just vacated. Of his original 200,000 soldiers, approximately 100,000 reached American lines. His refusal to obey Hitler preserved an estimated 250,000 civilians. Individual tales conveyed the desperation people faced. Luftwaffe pilot Klaus Hartmann flew his Bf-109 westward until his fuel depleted, force landing in an American-held territory rather than risk Soviet zones. Submarine commander Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock motored his vessel as far up the Elbe as feasible, then scuttled the ship and led his crew overland to American lines. A Wehrmacht physician remained beside severely injured soldiers, unable to travel, accepting Soviet imprisonment, saying simply, "Someone must care for those left behind." A young soldier surrendered his seat on an overcrowded transport to an elderly person, then began a 100-kilometer walk to safety. He arrived 18 hours past the ceasefire deadline, technically too late, yet compassionate American soldiers accepted him. Camps such as Remagen, Bad Orb, and Lambsdorff became processing centers for this human flood. These makeshift facilities, frequently just open fields with barbed wire fencing, housed more than 1 million German prisoners by May 15th. Conditions were sparse, but not deadly. The vital distinction from Soviet imprisonment. Initially, prisoners lacked shelter besides self-dug holes. Food consisted of basic rations. 1,200 calories each day initially, gradually increased as provisions became available. Water came from streams and hastily constructed pipes. Sanitation remained basic. Illness spread rapidly in crowded conditions. Yet death rates stayed below 1%, dramatically different from Soviet camps where 35% or higher perished. Colonel James Foster, administering Remagen camp, tackled staggering obstacles. The facility was designed for 100,000, but contained 184,000 by May 12th. SS officers shared space with communist prisoners. Hitler Youth teenagers stood alongside battle-hardened Stalingrad veterans. Female service members needed separate quarters. Sailors who'd never experienced ground warfare mixed with everyone else. "We managed the disorder while preserving life," he explained. Recording showed complete Wehrmacht disintegration. Some units showed up with thorough records enabling proper documentation. Many had nothing besides names that men remembered. The legendary 16th Panzer Division arrived with 312 soldiers from an authorized strength of 14,000. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division consisted of 89 elderly men. Categorization became impossible. Were Hitler Youth participants military combatants or juveniles? Were female assistants combatants or civilians? Were Volkssturm members soldiers or conscripted civilians? American administrators generally selected humanitarian classifications, treating everyone as prisoners entitled to Geneva Convention protections. The German forces' flight illuminated what Soviet territories would undergo. Files from the NKVD released following 1991 confirmed German concerns were well-founded. Of some 3 million German soldiers captured by Soviets, roughly 1.1 million perished in captivity. Death rates between 1945 and 1946 topped 50% in numerous facilities. Multiple factors contributed. Soviet supply systems scarcely sustained their own fighting forces, much less millions of captives. German captives received 600 to 800 calories daily, insufficient for surviving forced labor. Medical support practically didn't exist. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis circulated freely. Siberian cold plummeted to negative 40 degrees Celsius with inadequate clothing or heated quarters. Beyond physical shortage came organized brutality. Soviet personnel, numerous having suffered German violence, demonstrated minimal compassion. Captives toiled in uranium extraction without safeguards, timber operations with impossible demands, engineering tasks where human safety meant nothing. The wounded and the sick found themselves in impossible positions. When they could no longer work, they became expendable. Soviet officer Viktor Astafiev would later recall the brutal logic that governed this world. "We were told every fallen German represented payment," he wrote, "payment for what Leningrad endured, payment for Stalingrad's devastation, payment for the 27 million Soviet dead." The guards operated under a chilling competition. Who could extract the most labor before a prisoner simply gave out? To show any compassion was considered betrayal, a dishonoring of those who'd fallen. The numbers painted the complete picture. When Americans held German prisoners, roughly 137,000 died out of 3.8 million in their custody, translating to a 3.6% mortality rate. Most of these deaths stemmed from wounds already sustained before capture, or from diseases that ravaged the camps during the war's final chaotic phase. By June 1945, the situation had improved dramatically in American camps, with monthly deaths dropping to just 0.15%. The Soviet records, even their official accounts, revealed something far darker. Soviet authorities themselves documented 356,700 German prisoner deaths, yet German researchers uncovered evidence pointing to well over 1 million. The grim reality emerged when investigators examined who actually survived beyond 1950. Those captured in 1945 faced odds that were staggering. Fewer than half made it home. Certain groups faced even starker fates. Waffen-SS soldiers had only a 1 in 5 chance in Soviet camps, while 95% survived in American hands. Women serving in auxiliary roles experienced systematic brutality under Soviet control, though Americans typically released them within months. Hitler Youth members often faced immediate execution by Soviet troops, branded as fascist zealots, whereas Americans processed them as troubled teenagers needing rehabilitation, not annihilation. The wave of German surrenders to Western forces in 1945 carried profound implications for Europe's future. American and British armies now held the majority of surviving German military personnel, an intelligence windfall as the Cold War dawned. Operation Paperclip succeeded partly because technical experts had deliberately positioned themselves to surrender to the Americans rather than face Soviet capture. Werner von Braun's rocket specialists trekked 500 kilometers through collapsing German defenses with a singular purpose: to reach American lines. "We view the French with disgust," von Braun confided to colleagues. "The Soviets inspire fear. The British cannot support us. That leaves only the Americans." His calculation would eventually place human beings on the moon. The demographic consequences were equally profound. Eastern territories, Silesia, Pomerania, they suffered catastrophic losses of military-age men, killed in battle, fled westward, or vanished into Soviet captivity. Entire family lines simply ceased to exist. East Germany would wrestle with gender imbalances for decades, a legacy of those vanished millions. The psychological wound penetrated generations. Families torn apart by the border dividing Germany often traced that separation back to May 1945, to moments of desperation when some managed to reach American lines while others became trapped in Soviet occupation. Survival itself became arbitrary, determined entirely by which army encountered you first. That randomness became a defining trauma for German survivors. By 11 p.m. on May 8, 1945, when the ceasefire took effect, American forces had processed approximately 1.5 million German military prisoners within the final 3 weeks of war. The 102nd Infantry Division alone accepted the surrender of 313,000 soldiers, surpassing the entire German invasion force that had entered Poland in 1939. The scale left observers reeling. The U.S. Ninth Army reported 423,000 prisoners between April 20th and May 8th. The First Army processed 387,000. Remarkably, fewer than 20,000 fell through actual combat. The rest surrendered of their own volition, often forcing their way through their own defensive lines to do so. General Omar Bradley later reflected on the bewildering scene. "We prepared for victory, not for this." The German army didn't surrender in an orderly fashion. It simply dissolved. Men who'd fought with fanatical intensity for 6 years suddenly cared only about one thing: reaching American lines. They grasped what American soldiers would later confirm. American captivity meant life. Soviet captivity almost certainly meant death. The numbers kept climbing even after the ceasefire officially began. From May 8 through May 31st, another 874,000 German military personnel managed to reach Western Allied lines, having escaped from Soviet-controlled zones through sheer determination, administrative loopholes, or sympathetic interpretation of surrender protocols by American and British commanders. Individual accounts revealed the human dimensions behind those massive figures. Corporal Friedrich Müller surrendered at Tangamunda on May 5th and documented his experience in a diary he kept. "First day without fear in 6 years," he wrote. "The Americans gave us bread, actual bread, not the sawdust we knew. A guard offered me a cigarette. I wept. After everything we had done, why would they treat us as human beings?" Nurse Hildegard Schneider crossed the Elbe with a military hospital unit carrying 300 wounded. The Americans accepted every single patient, SS men included. Their surgeons operated through the night, fighting to save German lives. One physician told her simply, "The war has ended. Now we are doctors, and you are patients." Nothing we did merited such humanity. Private Hans Bauer, just 17, had been told Americans would torture captured soldiers, that surrender brought dishonor. Instead, he received chocolate, something he hadn't tasted in 3 years. An American medic cleaned and bandaged his infected wound. An officer inquired whether he could contact his mother. They regarded him not as an enemy, but as a boy caught in circumstances beyond his control. Former SS officer Wilhelm Hartung anticipated execution. Instead, American medical personnel treated his injuries. He eventually walked free. "I deserved no mercy," he would later testify. "My unit committed unspeakable acts." Yet Americans upheld the law rather than pursuing vengeance. That mercy proved more haunting than any punishment could have been. Hartung lived until 1982, long enough to reflect on those desperate final weeks. In a 1975 interview, he spoke about his choice to defy Hitler's orders and save his men rather than throw them away in a pointless last stand. "I would make the same choice again. My obligation was to the soldiers under my command, not to a dying ideology. Every man we got across the Elbe represented a victory. Every civilian we protected was a triumph. We lost the war, but in those final moments we salvaged what mattered most: human lives." He never apologized for his defiance. Hitler demanded we sacrifice ourselves for his delusional fantasy. I chose instead to protect my men for their futures, for Germany's survival. Between honor and humanity, I selected humanity. History must render its verdict on whether I chose correctly. His decisions enabled roughly 250,000 soldiers and civilians to escape Soviet capture. Survivors and their descendants still convene annually on May 8th, gathering to remember this general who embraced life over death, mercy over ideology. The mass German surrender to American forces that April and May represented far more than simple military capitulation. It constituted a massive humanitarian crisis, an ideological collapse, and ultimately a monument to mercy's transformative power during warfare's darkest moments. This event challenged conventional historical narratives. German soldiers didn't simply cease fighting when orders came down. They deliberately sought American imprisonment as their only chance of survival. The disciplined Wehrmacht of 1940 had transformed into a desperate mass by 1945, willing to gamble everything to evade Soviet retribution. American soldiers experienced their own transformation. Young men who'd battled across Europe suddenly found themselves saving enemies who days earlier had tried to kill them. The organized manner in which American forces handled this crisis, despite being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and facing impossible logistical demands, showcased American organizational prowess and basic humanity. Military historian John Keegan observed that the German rush toward American lines remained unprecedented in warfare's history. Never before had such vast numbers deliberately sought specific captivity while retaining the capacity to continue fighting. It proved that even in total war, calculations of mercy versus revenge could supersede ideology and commands. Heinrich Fischer, a 63-year-old Wehrmacht member, crossed at Tangamundabridge as the final German soldier. He reached American lines at 10:47 p.m. on May 8, 1945, 14 minutes before the ceasefire began. When soldiers asked why he'd risked crossing, his response was simple and profound. "I wanted to see my grandchildren." He did. Millions who failed to reach American lines never would. Private First Class Joseph Martinez processed surrendering Germans and offered perhaps the most insightful observation. They weren't truly surrendering to us. They were running from something considerably worse. We represented the possibility of life. Any one of us might have made identical choices in their circumstances. The German flight westward in 1945 illuminated fundamental truths about conflict and human nature. Even in humanity's most devastating war, the disparity between mercy and revenge, between survival and annihilation, hinged on a single determining factor: which uniform received your surrender. For hundreds of thousands of Germans in April and May 1945, that distinction encompassed everything. The choice between American and Soviet captivity transcended matters of comfort or ease. It encompassed survival itself. The statistical record was unambiguous. Those surrendering to Western allies survived captivity at a 96.4% rate. Those captured by Soviets returned home at rates below 65%. Behind these percentages existed countless individual stories, tales of endurance and loss that would ripple through families, communities, and entire nations across generations to come. Yet statistics concealed a more fundamental truth. The American response to this crisis, providing nourishment to former adversaries, treating their wounds, maintaining order despite overwhelming numbers, demonstrated that humanity could transcend vengeance even in total war, in the aftermath of devastating conflict. American servicemen, numerous having witnessed friends fall to German weapons, selected duty and decency over retribution. The damaged bridge at Tangamundabridge became far more than a physical span across the Elbe River. It represented a crossing between life and death, between mercy and retribution, between competing visions of what victory meant in Eastern versus Western terms. Soldiers who successfully crossed before May 8, 1945, generally survived to rebuild their existence and their nation. Those who didn't faced prolonged suffering in Soviet detention facilities. If they survived the experience at all, the surrender also embodied warfare's supreme irony. The Wehrmacht, which commenced as conquering forces seeking living space in the Eastern territories, concluded as a desperate throng fleeing eastward. The master race doctrine disintegrated into frightened individuals pursuing only survival. The 1,000-year Reich endured barely 12 years, terminating with its soldiers racing to surrender to armies they'd once derided as decadent democracies. For historians and scholars, the event presents troubling questions. Did American acceptance of these surrenders represent humanitarian triumph or violation of inter-Allied agreements? Did preserving German soldiers from Soviet captivity serve justice or undermine it? Debate continues, yet the human consequences remain indisputable. The impact persists. German-American relations in the post-war years bore the unmistakable imprint of American clemency. West Germany's incorporation into NATO, its transformation into a functioning democracy, its emergence as America's indispensable European partner throughout the Cold War, all were profoundly shaped by memories of American restraint in victory. The last crossings at the Elbe constituted far more than simply the war's conclusion. They represented history's greatest gamble on human mercy, a desperate wager by vanquished enemies that their conquerors would select humanity over revenge. For those who successfully made the crossing, it became a wager that yielded the only currency ultimately worth anything: their own lives and, through them, the destiny of a nation that would emerge from devastation to anchor European democracy. The damaged bridge at Tangamunda, where so many transitioned from death to life, remained unrepaired. Yet its memory stands as testament to one of warfare's most essential truths. In the final analysis, victory's true measure lies not in adversaries destroyed, but in lives preserved, not in vengeance extracted, but in compassion demonstrated. This comprises the ultimate teaching of the German rush toward American lines in 1945, that even in history's most calamitous conflict, humanity could conquer hatred, mercy could vanquish revenge, and life could eclipse death. For the hundreds of thousands who traversed the Elbe during those harrowing days, that decision altered everything about their futures. Their passage represented not merely escape from Soviet violence, it embodied transition from the epoch of total war and ideological slaughter to prospects for a world grounded in law, justice, and human worth. That so many staked everything to reach American lines transcended military calculation alone. It testified to mercy's profound capacity when displayed by victors. The narrative comes full circle, returning to that damaged bridge spanning the Elbe River, where desperate soldiers transformed into grateful prisoners, where American servicemen became unexpected guardians, and where the uncomplicated choice to accept surrender represented an assertion of humanity's potential for compassion, even in its bleakest moments. That endures as the legacy of those devastating months in 1945. Evidence that even in total war's aftermath, the choice between compassion and vengeance, between our highest humanity and our basest instincts, could determine not merely individual destinies, but the trajectory of entire nations and how history itself would ultimately remember us.